Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. I want to use today's video to talk about the horror genre because it is a genre that I have admired and enjoyed a great deal over many years now, and I've actually studied it a lot as well. I did 3 years of my undergraduate degree in university, of which much of that was focused on horror literature and film. So it is a favourite genre, and it's also one that frustrates me a little bit with regards to video games, because it does seem that, as a general rule, game developers are a little bit limited in their range when compared to what horror filmmakers and horror writers can achieve. Also, in just the last month, I've played Resident Evil Village, Maid of Sker, Song of Darkness, and also previewed House of Ashes. So I am knee-deep in the genre right now. For whatever reason, it seems like there's a lot of horror games coming out of a fairly high profile, so now seemed like the right time to do this video. So I will start by quoting Stephen King, who, in addition to being a great writer, is also an exceptional theorist of the genre. Not a lot of people know that, but he wrote a book on horror theory called Danse Macabre, and in that he outlines 3 distinct classes of horror. I'm going to read the whole quote because the rest of the video is then going to be about discussing the implications of it with regards to video games. So, the 3 types of horror as described by King. The first is the gross out. It's the sight of a severed head tumbling down a flight of stairs. It's when the lights go out and something green and slimy splatters against your arm. The second is called just the horror. It's the unnatural. It's spiders the size of bears. It's the dead waking up and walking around. It's when the lights go out and something with claws grabs you by the arm. And then there's the third and worst one, terror. Terror is when you come home and notice that everything you have owned has been taken away and replaced with an exact substitute. It's when the lights go out and you feel something behind you, you hear it, you feel its breath against your ear, but when you turn around, there's nothing there. Now, when you think about video games, this industry is very, very good at the first category of horror, as well as the second, but really, the first one they've refined to an art form. Video game horror absolutely loves its gore and bloodletting, and that is a manifestation of gross-out horror. It's crass and it's totally unintelligent, but it is repulsive, effectively so. And repulsive is a very low, very primitive kind of horror response. We see something that is ugly and cruel to our senses, and we naturally want to either destroy it or flee from it. That's what developers tap into when they make these really violent horror games. The gross out is relatively easy for game developers to implement. As long as you've got enough processing power, as they do with consoles and PCs now, then you can render some incredibly hideously ugly things and really overemphasize the gore and extreme violence to an extent that even film can't get away with. So if you look at something like what Ethan goes through in Resident Evil Village, for example, like when he gets his hands impaled through meat hooks or whatever, only to heal that away with a little bit of a health spray, surviving that kind of extreme violence is reserved for dumb horror comedies in film and literature. But in the video game industry, the game developers have refined that to a point that they can keep the atmosphere of their horror going while still depicting something that extreme. The second is also game friendly, and we're talking about horror, the category of horror, not horror genre. It's confusing. I wish Stephen King came up with a better second category term, but the category horror where he's talking about the unnatural. The unnatural can refer to monsters and zombies and things that we see in video games all the time, but it's also, when you think about it, it's also the jump scare. When you think about the mechanics of a jump scare is effective because it takes the natural state of things where you're walking through a quiet hallway, forest or whatever, and then absolutely disrupts it with a loud noise, windows breaking, a monster suddenly appearing right in front of you. This second form of horror category, is a relatively easy thing for game developers to implement as well, because generally speaking, creating that disruption to the natural order is a simple matter of juxtaposition. You superimpose something very unnatural over something that's very natural. It's about taking the expectations of what the player will see on the screen and doing something different. It's that kind of simple thing. And you don't need to put much further thought into it than that. It's the third one where game developers really struggle, and that is Stephen King's idea of terror. because terror relies on implication and a kind of slowness. Terror only works if you have the time to reflect on what you've seen. And how many horror games give you a genuine period of time to just be thinking without actually having some kind of experience tied up with it? To highlight what I mean, I'll actually point to a film, and it's called The Empty Man. If you haven't seen it yet and you like your horror, then you should absolutely see it. It was a film that was a box office bomb, but it has since become very well regarded as a genre masterpiece because it perfectly encapsulates the problem that game developers have. And it increasingly is actually an issue with film as well, but it's a good example of how you can reach for terror and how hard it is to then describe and properly depict it in any other form other than these kinds of long-winded, slow experiences. See, The Empty Man is horror because it is philosophy. Like, the film actually name drops philosophers in explaining a lot of what's going on in the film, and it becomes terrifying in the most nihilistic way imaginable. But that is hard to show on screen via action. It is genuinely brilliant writing, acting, and just like Stephen King envisions when he describes terror, it stays with you and stays with you and stays with you. I still think about that film daily, months after seeing it for the first time. But you can't really put that form of horror that The Empty Man offers into a neat, convenient, easy to consume kind of packet of horror. So when they tried to make the trailer of The Empty Man, for example, they only had 60 seconds, 90 seconds to work with. So what they did, the producers, they resorted to positioning the film as an urban legend thing, where people accidentally summoned a monster that they shouldn't have into the world. The producers actually moved the horror from terror down into that kind of horror category. And it works at a trailer level because you have 90 seconds and it presents a much more visceral, immediate threat that you don't have when you don't have 2 hours to explain it. But when the audience actually went into the film to watch The Empty Man, they were ultimately disappointed that the film didn't match up with the trailer because the film is this work of terror, whereas the trailer is a work of horror. Now, video game developers face that same problem that the producers of The Empty Man faced. They need to target a much more visceral space because video games are experiences that are streamed because they are an inherently action-orientated medium, and because, as a storyteller, you rarely have a long time to set up a work of terror in video games. There are exceptions. Horror-themed visual novels like Seia no Uta, where you never really see the monster as such, or Deathmark, where it has that very fetishistic kind of sexualization to the horror, which has implications that kind of stay with you well beyond the game itself. Those kinds of visual novels go to great lengths to leave you thinking over the implications rather than the moment-to-moment shocks that you encounter along the way. Some other kind of earlier examples of horror games like Silent Hill and Project Zero are also very clever in the way that they take the lower forms of horror, so the kind of the gory, gross out horror, and then also the jump scare stuff, and throw them at players so you have that experience. But ultimately, by the time you get to the end of it, the implications or the revelations are very much an example of terror. They're a little bit like Stephen King's own It in that way. So Pennywise, if you've read it, not so much the films, but in the book, Pennywise is almost a bait and switch. He's there, and he offers both gross out horror and horror, as in King's second tier category. But the last tenth of the book is absolute terror instead, and Pennywise is almost a puppet in that. He's not really the antagonist anymore because the book has kind of transcended the horror and the gross out to become this work of terror. But back to video games. Games that manage to move up the category to become works of terror are either niche as anything visual novels or they're earlier examples of the genre. Modern horror is almost exclusively about two things. Firstly, it's about the immediate, i.e. you're never asked to actually think about what's immediately in front of you, just react to it. And it's about the visceral, it's about escalating the violence and the grotesque qualities of horror in an ever more desperate attempt to shock players. Now, this kind of horror can be hugely entertaining and it makes for some great, fun games. And it's certainly not saying that any form of horror is inferior to one another. When Stephen King came up with these three little categories, it wasn't to suggest that one is better or worse than the other. It was more just to define the three different approaches to horror as he saw them. So it's not about that. It's not about saying that video games are an inferior type of horror. It's just that video games are missing one type of horror, which is that terror horror. But the thing is, we are largely missing the intellectual value of this genre in video games by excluding terror. And I do think that this genre can offer us so much more than it currently does from that regard. So many times when we talk about horror, we talk about it being a genre that is really quite low. It's not very intelligent, it's not very engaging, it doesn't give us much insight. But the reality is it's actually quite the opposite. When it's done well, horror is one of the most intense genres for thought. And it's that thought that we're kind of missing from video games at the moment. There are some, like I said, there are some isolated examples of it, but I would just like to see developers get a little bit more experimental with horror, rather than just keep trying to give people thrills and chills. Try to encourage them to think about things, put some philosophy into the horror games, make them something to muse on as well. And when we do that, I think horror video games will hit a new level entirely. Okay, so that's enough for this video. Do let me know your own thoughts in the comments. If you're a horror fan, sound out and let's have a good chat about your favourite horror works and whatever. If you have seen The Empty Man, do let me know. I've been dying to talk about that one with people. Other than that, please do click that like and subscribe button if you enjoy my videos. That way you won't miss one as I upload them. And also, if you want to support what we're doing at digitallydownloaded.net, please do consider backing us on Patreon. You can do so for just $1 a month. And by doing so, not only do you support all these videos that we're doing, all the work we do in the written form on digitallydownloaded.net, but you also get a digital magazine each month. It's this gorgeous 48-page production, and yeah, I think it's a pretty nice little thank you note to the people that support everything we do. All right, thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you at the next one.